Welcome everyone to Multidimensional Health with Dr. Toni. If you don't know me, I am your host, Toni Camacho, a best-selling author, holistic health practitioner, registered herbalist, and doctor of psychology. And I will be sharing with you today the benefits of eating fermented food as well as a few recipes that you can use in case you want to do some fermenting on your own. So let's get started by covering the basic. What is fermentation? Fermentation is the process of breaking down organic substances by introducing yeast or bacteria. When fermentation happens in your body, it's part of a metabolic process that produces chemical changes through the actions of enzymes. In biochemistry, fermentation is defined as the extraction of energy from carbohydrates in the absence of oxygen. So how does fermentation work? Microorganisms survive by using the carbohydrates you eat, like sugar and glucose, for energy and fuel. This process breaks down sugar into acid and alcohol, making it more nutritious and preserving it to be stored for longer without spoiling. The breakdown process provides foods with the enzymes required for digestion. Essentially, when a food is fermented, it's broken down similarly to the way it will be in your gut before anyone is even consumed. Since the Neolithic age, people have been fermenting foods, and that was way before the benefits of fermentation process were understood. Some common foods that use the fermentation process include sourdough bread, wine, cheese, kombucha, sauerkraut, and kimchi. There are three types of fermentation process that people use to ferment their foods. So now let's take a look at them. The first one is lactic acid fermentation. This type of fermentation happens when yeast strains and bacteria convert starches or sugars into lactic acid. Lactic acid bacteria are vital to producing and preserving inexpensive, wholesome foods, which has been extremely important for feeding impoverished cultures. The lactic acid fermentation method makes foods like sauerkraut, pickles, kimchi, yogurt, and sourdough bread. The second type of fermentation is alcohol fermentation. In this type of fermentation, yeast breaks down the molecules in starch or sugar and turns them into alcohol and carbon dioxide molecules. This type of fermentation creates wine and beer. Vodka is also made from the fermentation of grains or potatoes. And the last type of fermentation is acetic acid fermentation. This is when starches and sugars from grains and fruit ferment into sour-tasting vinegar and condiments to make things like apple cider vinegar, wine vinegar, or kombucha. Many people have asked me, what is the best option for good digestion, probiotics or fermented foods? Well, the answer is that both. They both play a role in healthy digestion, but they aren't quite the same thing. Probiotics are defined as the good, hence the pro, bacteria in our gastrointestinal tract. In order to be called a probiotic, the food or supplement has to yield a health benefit to the person consuming it. Fermented foods are not as regulated. They don't have to meet any standards and can contain both good and bad bacteria. The bottom line is this: including fermented foods into your diet is not the same as taking a probiotic. Now let's talk about the role of fermented foods in your microbiome. Your microbiome is like a rainforest with multiple species of bacteria, yeast, and enzymes living together. When you have a healthy balance of yeast and bacteria in your gut, fermented foods are fine to eat because they feed the majority of good bacteria and yeast. Fermented foods aid your digestive system. Health benefits of probiotic-rich fermented foods can enhance the gut biome by improving digestion and boosting the immune system. Why? Because the fermentation process creates an environment that allows certain good bacteria to multiply quickly. This process produces enzymes and nutrients along with prebiotics, which feed the probiotics that already exist in your gut, the good bacteria, and makes them stronger. Now, let me be clear that fermented foods do not benefit everyone. If you have an imbalanced gut, then fermented foods you eat can feed the bad bacteria, create overpopulation, and cause more problems. The benefits of fermented foods go beyond the health of your digestive tract. They could also improve your mental health. Your gut and brain have a close relationship, known in the medical field as the gut-brain axis. 90% of our serotonin, the happiness hormone, is produced in the gut. This is a widely studied connection, and there's always research coming out about how the foods we eat can affect our mental health. If you live with mental issues like anxiety or depression, staying up to date with research in this field can improve your overall health and quality of life. Here's a couple of tips when you're shopping for fermented foods. When choosing pickled fermented vegetables at the store, make sure that the jar or package says raw and unpasteurized or lacto-fermented. That way you know that good bacteria are still alive and ready to populate your gut. As I promised at the start, I'm going to share a few homemade recipes for fermented foods. Let's start with kombucha. Kombucha is made from SCOBY. That means symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeast, mixed with sweetened tea. It has been around for over 2,000 years and is beloved for its B vitamins, probiotic bacteria, and tangy flavor. And here's the recipe. This one makes 1 gallon. Here are the ingredients. 3/4 of a gallon of distilled spring or well water, as chlorinated or treated water can harm the kombucha culture. 2 tablespoons of organic black or organic green loose leaf tea. 1 cup of organic cane sugar. Kombucha SCOBY. 1 to 2 cups of starter liquid. And that's brewed kombucha reserved from a previous brew batch. And if you don't have one at home, then just buy one at the store and use it as a starter kit. Here are the directions. Add tea to a large mesh tea infuser. Bring water to a boil, then turn off the heat. Add loose leaf to the water in a large cotton tea net or mesh tea ball infuser. Add the sugar and stir. Remove from the hot burner. Let tea steep to desired strength, then remove from liquid. Cover with lid. Allow to cool to room temperature. Pour liquid into fermentation vessel. This vessel is best to be glass or lead-free ceramic. Add the SCOBY and the starter liquid. Cover container with a clean piece of cloth, kitchen towel, or handkerchief and tie with a strong rubber band or a string. Taste kombucha periodically. Most batches will be ready in 7 to 14 days, but the temperature of your home and how sweet and sour you like it will vary your optimal fermentation time. When fermentation has reached your taste preference, carefully remove the SCOBY and place it in a clean bowl. Reserve 1 to 2 cups of kombucha to be used as a starter liquid for your next batch. Store with the SCOBY. Use a funnel to pour the fermented tea into bottles. To add some flavor to your kombucha, you can add some fruit and ginger. Ginger kombucha is delicious, and it's even more awesome if you add some fresh fruit. You can add some fresh peaches or strawberries or any other ripe delicious fruit hanging around your kitchen. Chop them up and then add them along with the ginger. When using fruit, I usually let everything hang out in a clean canning jar for a few days to infuse, then strain and bottle. It's easier than straining out the fruit when you pour. Another recipe I want to share with you is how to ferment vegetables. Pickling and fermenting are sometimes confused with each other, but they are distinctly different. The pickling process preserves food in a brine, that means salt or salty water, or an acid like vinegar. The lactofermentation preserves food with bacteria without the use of milk. Here's a recipe to make your own lactofermented vegetables. Ingredients: 3 tablespoons of sea salt, 1 quart of water, 1 cup of small cauliflower florets, 1 cup carrot chunks or slices, 1 cup red bell pepper chunks or slices, 1 clove garlic, smashed and peeled, 1 bay leaf, half a teaspoon of coriander seeds, 1/4 teaspoon of black peppercorns, 1 to 2 grape leaves. This is optional to help keep pickles crisp. Here are the instructions. Combine the salt and water in a measuring cup and stir until the salt is dissolved. You may heat the water first to make the salt easier to dissolve, but it's not necessary. If you do use hot water, then let it come to room temperature before making the pickles. Place the remaining ingredients in a very clean, large jar. A half a gallon mason jar works well. Pour the salt water over the vegetables, leaving at least 1 inch of headspace on the top of the jar. If necessary, you can add more water to cover the vegetables. Cover the jar tightly and let it stand at room temperature. About once a day, open the jar to taste the pickles and release gases produced during fermentation. If any mold or scum has formed on the top, simply skim it off. When the pickles taste to your liking, transfer the jar to the refrigerator. They will continue to ferment very slowly, but cold storage will largely halt the fermentation. As fermented food, these pickles will last for quite some time, at least a month or longer. You can eat these vegetables on their own as a side dish or stack these vegetables in sandwiches. Toss them in salads, chop them up, and fold them into spreads and dips, or just munching them as a snack. The next recipe I want to share with you is mason jar sauerkraut. Whip up some sauerkraut to have on hand when you want a salty, sour boost to your meal. And this is how you make it. 1 medium head green cabbage, about 3 pounds. 1.5 teaspoons of kosher salt. 1 tablespoon of caraway seeds. This is optional for flavor. Here are the instructions. When fermenting anything, it is best to give the good beneficial bacteria every chance of succeeding by starting off with a clean environment as possible. Make sure your mason jar and jelly jar are washed and rinsed of all soap residue. You will be using your hands to massage the salt into the cabbage, so give those hands a good wash too. Next, slice the cabbage. Cut the cabbage into quarters and trim out the core. Slice each quarter down its length, making 8 wedges. Slice each wedge crosswise into very thin ribbons. Next, you're going to combine the cabbage and the salt. And you do this by transferring the cabbage into a big bowl and sprinkle the salt over the top. Begin working the salt into the cabbage by massaging and squeezing the cabbage with your hands. At first, it might not seem like enough salt, but gradually the cabbage will become watery and limp. It will start looking more like coleslaw than raw cabbage. This will take 5 to 10 minutes. If you like to flavor your sauerkraut with caraway seeds, mix them in now. The next step is to pack the cabbage into the jar. Grab handfuls of the cabbage and pack them into the canning jar. If you have a canning funnel, this will make the job easier. Every so often, tamp down the cabbage in the jar with your fist. Pour any liquid released by the cabbage while you were massaging it into the jar. Once all the cabbage is packed into the mason jar, slip the smaller jelly jar into the mouth of the jar and weigh it down with the clean stones or marbles. This will help keep the cabbage weighed down and eventually submerge beneath this liquid. Cover the mouth of the mason jar with a cloth and secure it with a rubber band or twine. This allows the air to flow in and out of the jar but prevents dust or insects from getting into the jar. Over the next 24 hours, press down on the cabbage every so often with the jelly jar. As the cabbage releases its liquid, it will become more limp and compact, and the liquid will rinse over the top of the cabbage. If after 24 hours the liquid has not risen above the cabbage, dissolve 1 teaspoon of salt in 1 cup of water and add enough to submerge the cabbage. Ferment the cabbage for 3 to 10 days. As the cabbage is fermenting, keep the sauerkraut away from direct sunlight at a cool temperature, ideally 65 degrees to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Check it daily and press it down if the cabbage is floating about the liquid. Because this is a small batch of sauerkraut, it will ferment more quickly than larger batches. Start tasting it after 3 days. When the sauerkraut tastes good to you, remove the weight, screw on the cap, and refrigerate. You can also allow the sauerkraut to continue fermenting for 10 days or even longer. There is no hard and fast rule for when the sauerkraut is done. Go by how it tastes. While it's fermenting, you may see bubbles coming through the cabbage, foam to the top, or white scum. These are all signs of healthy, happy fermentation process. The scum can be skimmed off the top either during the fermentation or before refrigerating. If you see mold, skim it off immediately and make sure your cabbage is fully submerged. Don't eat any moldy parts close to the surface, but the rest of the sauerkraut is fine. This sauerkraut is a fermented product, so it will keep for at least 2 months and often longer if it's kept in the refrigerator. As long as it still tastes and smells good to eat, it will be. You can eat this wonderful sauerkraut on hot dogs, sandwiches, potatoes, and any other food you like. Miso is another fermented food that I love. Now, I'm not going to ask you to make miso because that's a complicated process, but you can always buy it at the grocery store. Miso is made from fermented soybeans or other grains and is packed with yummy, salty flavor that can be used for much more than miso soup. There are a ton of recipes online for different ways to use miso. However, my favorite is super simple. I just warm up water, add a teaspoon to a cup, mix and drink, just like if it was tea. Sometimes I even add ginger. It is delicious and super healthy and a great way to start the day. The following recipe is for Beet Cabas, which is a fermented beverage with many uses including cocktails, vinaigrettes, and even on its own. It has an earthy flavor and a bit of fizziness. This is how you do it. Use 12 ounces of beets, approximately, 1 to 2 teaspoons of sea salt, and as optional flavorings, you can add ginger, lemon, oranges, and other spices. Yummy. Here's the instructions. Clean and trim the beets. Scrap the beets, trim the tops and tails, but leave the skins on. Cut the beets into half-inch cubes. It is not necessary to cut precise shapes and sizes. You just want to give the beets enough surface area to ferment. However, avoid finely cutting or grating the beets, which can lead to very rapid fermentation and alcohol production. Place the beets in a very clean jar. Add the salt to the jar. If you wish, you can also add flavorings like ginger, lemon, oranges, or spices. Cover the beets with water, leaving at least 1 inch of headspace at the top of the jar. Cover the jar tightly, and you just let it ferment. Let the jar stand at room temperature. You may see bubbles inside the jar and brine may seep out of the lid. Place a bowl or plate under the jar to help catch any overflow. And check it daily. Open the jar once a day to taste the liquid and release gases produced during fermentation. If any mold or scum has formed on the top, simply skim it off. Now it's time to strain and refrigerate. When it tastes strong enough for your liking, strain out the beets and transfer the cabas to the refrigerator. You may drink it right away, but it's often best after a few days. This cabas will last for quite some time, at least a month or longer. I want to take a little bit more time to talk about when fermentation causes problems. FODMAP, which stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyops, refers to foods that contain carbohydrates that are fermented more rapidly in the gut and can therefore cause more rapid gas production. If you suffer from issues like bloating or gas, eating foods that are high in FODMAP can make your symptoms worse. So, if you have a gut issue, try and limit your intake of fermented foods until you restore a healthy balance of good bacteria in your gut. Start with small amounts and cut back if you feel any discomfort. I cover a lot of ground here, so it makes sense that you might have questions. If you do have questions regarding fermentation or any other health issue, email me at contacttoni at D as in David, R as in Rose, Toni with an I, CAMACHO.com, or visit my website at www.D as in David, R as in Rose, Toni with an I, CAMACHO.com. Thank you all for spending your time with me today. I hope that you all learned some valuable information about fermented foods. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please don't hesitate to contact me. I am here for you, and I'll see you next week.